So my name is Mark Walker, and I am actually the CEO of StrongPoint. This is something that I've really had a bee in my bonnet about for about a decade, about how to manage user roles more effectively and simplify things. So we've been doing a lot of work recently with a lot of our customers who are running our segregation of duty product around this. This is very critical to public companies when they're getting ready to implement segregation of duties, or if they want to actually make a simpler segregation of duties framework. But as we start to work with it, we realize this is generally applicable to the entire NetSuite community. And so the capabilities I'm going to be showing you today are available both in our segregation of duties product, but they're also available in our documentation optimization product, the very basic part of the sales of the StrongPoint world. So today I'm going to give you a quick overview of how this all fits into our view of agile management of NetSuite. And then I'm going to be reviewing with you some specific steps you can take. Now, these steps, many of these steps you can take whether or not you're a StrongPoint customer. We give you tools for doing this. In fact, we have a guide coming out in January for doing this. But I also want to talk to you about some basic things that you can implement fairly quickly, whether or not you're a StrongPoint customer. And then I'll give you a walk through a brief demo of these capabilities inside one of our test environments. And then we'll talk a bit about what's next, what's coming next for StrongPoint and where we're going. We'll have some opportunity for some questions at that point too. So StrongPoint is a suite of products that's designed to help people manage NetSuite more effectively. And on the left-hand side, we have our flashlight product, which is tremendously popular. It's a very easy to adopt, $2.99 a month automated documentation system for NetSuite. And it actually has some of the capabilities we're going to be talking about today. In fact, it has quite a few of them actually are already available in our flashlight product. The normal product people use for managing this sort of thing is our documentation optimization product, which goes beyond flashlight. First of all, it's meant to be used by teams. And secondly, you can deploy it in the sandbox environment. And thirdly, it has lots and lots of tools for doing things like cleanup. It tracks utilization information or other things that are going to help it make it really, really useful for cleaning up a NetSuite account. And for those of you who haven't had a demo of this, I encourage you to reach out to our team. It's remarkably simple to understand and extremely effective. The part we won't be spending a lot of time on is the intelligent change management part of StrongPoint. It's really the core of our IT general control system. It's sometimes described as a closed loop change management system. So it's a self-auditing change management system. And it's ideal for either public companies or companies where you have lots of hands in the cookie jar, but you don't have anybody who's actually able to monitor what all those hands are doing. And you need to put an automated system in to help understand risk. I'm not going to cover that today, but it's by far our most popular set of capabilities in the system. And then we'll move over down to the enterprise compliance section. And segregation of duties, native segregation of duties and access controls are really at the root of this. We'll touch on this briefly. I'm not going to do a full demo of how the SOD system works today. There are other webinars that cover that. There's also videos and guides, and of course you have access to our team to get a full demonstration. The key differences in the segregation of duties capabilities between other things that exist in the market, two key differences is one is they're built right into NetSuite, which means that they can function as a gateway on the assignment of roles, and I'll be showing you that. And the second key difference is they're designed to automatically integrate into a change management process so that people don't need to actually go to another application in order to get permission to use things. I'll show you that very quickly. The reason why it's relevant, though, is if you put a segregation of duties system, and by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, segregation of duties is if you can do A, you shouldn't be allowed to do B. And access control, so for example, if you can create a vendor, you shouldn't be able to write a check to that vendor. That would seem to be dangerous. You shouldn't be able to approve your own journal entries. That might be dangerous. The access control part is one-sided. You shouldn't be able to give somebody the administrator role without permission. You shouldn't be able to give people the ability to delete transactions without permission. You shouldn't be able to give people the ability change the GL, and you can think of all sorts of things, the permissions that exist in your NetSuite system, where you would not want somebody getting access to those things without explicit permission. This form of access control is going to become really, really important starting in 2020 for almost everybody. It already hit our European customers in 2018, where GDPR and CCPA are going to start to require us to be able to demonstrate control over who can see what data, and that you have an auditing system on that. And that will, of course, apply to private companies as well as public companies. So we're not going to spend too much time on that. We're going to focus on the real practicality of what do you do if you've got a whole bunch of people using a whole bunch of different user roles and you need to get on top of it. So the first reason, the first thing to think about is, why would you do this, right? Because when you clean up your user roles, one of the dangers that you might run into, and the reason why people don't generally do it, is the user roles define the ability for people to do things. And so if you clean them up incorrectly or not in a very systemic way, you can cause all sorts of problems. You can break business processes. And if you're in a rigorous environment, like a publicly regulated, public or regulated company, or if you just want to sleep at night, what that leads to, if you don't do it in a very rigorous way, is the potential that you need to retest everything or a very large number of things. And that's something we want to avoid. Commonly, we hear from people who've used the external approach to doing SOD, segregation of duties analysis, for example, that they've discovered that every single one of their roles violates SOD, and therefore, since none of the code was ever documented as to what permissions it needed, they in theory have to retest their entire implementation, and that becomes very scary. And those people then end up running over to us and saying, "Wait a second, you guys own both sides of the fence. Can you help us get to where we need to get to?" And so we can. But the major reasons why you would want to clean up your roles are actually pretty straightforward, and not all of them will apply to each of you. The first one, the very, very first one that people often overlook, is security. This is going to come down, we hear about it every single day, people getting personal information taken out of their systems, people being penetrated in all sorts of different ways. The roles and permissions don't just govern the functionality of the system, they govern the access to the system. They govern what you can see and what you can change. So you really got to be really super careful about this, because we're talking about security not only in terms of data access, but also operational security, prevention of fraud. One of our customers came to us after they discovered that somebody had been writing checks without any effective control for a substantial amount of time, and there's really no way to get that back. I don't think they were actually checks. I think they were ACHs, but that was the same result. The second one is compliance. So at the core of any compliance regime, whether that's a SOX compliance regime under Rule 404 of SOX, or if that's a 23 CFR 11 FDA compliance, validation compliance process, or now under GDPR and CCPA, the key is to be able to demonstrate that you have a process for doing things. And if your user roles are all messy, it's going to be very difficult to prove that you have a tight process and that people can't do things. Your auditors will presume that anything that somebody can do, they will do, right? And that's fair enough, right? Because in the absence of a blocking control that you've built a piece of software that completely blocks somebody from doing it. But you're going to get the audit question. So much the better answer is to clean up the roles ahead of time. Segregation duties we've already talked about. More roles means more SOD violations. More permissions on each roles means more SOD violations. And you generally want to clean that up before you apply your SOD analysis, because once you apply it, you're now going to have to start talking to your auditors about what you discovered. So you generally want to clean up the roles ahead of time. And then reducing technical debt. We talked about this briefly before. It's very often overlooked. In theory, you should be testing every process against every role that could possibly run that process. Now, that's impractical for most NetSuite customers, but as you move forward, you don't want to have people, for example, with standard roles that could change NetSuite could change. That would be obviously, potentially a threat to your process. You don't want to have people using roles that are controlled by an external bundle unless that role is very, very specific to workflow under that bundle. So for example, we have roles in StrongPoint that are very specific and restricted to just the permissions we need when you're using StrongPoint if in very special circumstances, like auditors. And you wouldn't want somebody to be using that role for some other purpose. And finally, the more all your other roles, the more diversity of roles that you have, or the more multiple roles, the less control you have of somebody's user experience, which means the more complicated your testing. So how do you get your head around what can sometimes be a very complicated problem? And the answer is actually to proceed in a very stepwise fashion. There's some interesting attributes of the NetSuite environment that if you proceed in one order, you get a very, very systematic result. If you proceed in a different order, you could potentially make extremely serious mistakes. And so what we do is we advise customers to follow a very straightforward step-by-step analysis. And I'm actually going to be showing you the different views and talking about these steps in detail during a brief demo that we're going to do, but I want to walk through them in principle first. So the first one is, and by the way, I apologize for my voice, I have a cold. The first one is to identify any employees with standard or multiple roles. People with standard role, people should not know employees in your company, other than the administrators, should have standard roles. And the reason for that is you have no control over whether or not that role changes. And while NetSuite is incredibly responsible and has a fantastic track record of not messing things up by changing roles, they make no warranty at all that they're not going to, because as the product changes, these roles, these baseline roles may need to change with it. Similarly, people with multiple roles should be by far the exception than the rule. And in fact, we actually see in many accounts, they're by far the rule rather than the exception. Often what these are a blend of standard and custom roles. So at some point during implementation, somebody was given a standard role, and then somebody else pointed out that was a bad idea, and they were then given the custom role, and then and now you've got a problem with the standard role. The standard role is now deprecated, but it's still sitting there. Well, if you do SOD analysis, the SOD analysis isn't going to care that the person isn't using the role. They could use the role at any moment, so we'll have to analyze the permissions on a standard role, and you can't change standard roles. So it's a good idea to get rid of them as soon as possible. The second thing is to look at global permissions, because global permissions can be assigned. I'll show you sort of where they can be assigned, but global permissions can be assigned, and we have workflow for assigning them and for taking them back, but global permissions should be used only for temporary changes to somebody's permission. So Mary normally does this job function, and she's sick, so Bob is going to fill in for her. We don't want to change Bob's role because Bob doesn't normally do this. We're going to make a temporary grant of a global permission, and then we're going to monitor that and check to make sure that Bob didn't do anything bad while he had that permission, and then we'll take it away when Mary comes back from having the flu. That's an appropriate use of global permissions. Giving somebody a global permission for ongoing use is not recommended and is potentially extremely problematic. So you want to look at those and ask, why doesn't this person just have a different role? Why don't we have a standardized way of doing it? It also causes potential problems when, Bob, to use my example, Bob leaves the company, and now new Bob has to come in and take on the role, and nobody remembers that Bob's workflow depended on a critical permission, in which case new Bob may be missing data, or maybe missing context, or missing functionality that old Bob had. So keeping your permission side roles is super important. Identifying and inactivating the unassigned roles. Now this is a tremendous time saver, right? So if a role has not been assigned to anyone, you can inactivate it. And this is very important to stop somebody from assigning it in the future. In other words, if somebody wants to get access to that role in the future, they're going to actually have to go through the step of getting permission, to activate it. Now, StrongPoint has complete change control around all of this. So if somebody reactivated a role without getting permission, then the chief security officer or the CIO or CTO could then be alerted to say, hey, somebody's just activated a role and it had no change approval to do so. But this will also, most of these mistakes are just made by mistake. If you have an accountant role and an accountant reviewer role and a for our company, StrongPoint accountant role, then it's quite possible that when the new accountant is hired or retained, somebody gives them the wrong role. And giving the wrong role means either they get more access than you intended or less access than you intended, or sometimes it's just different access. They didn't receive the dashboard that you intended them to get. They didn't receive the list views that you had configured for them, because those list views and dashboards are tied to roles. So you generally want to get rid of, inactivate, you don't have to delete them, just inactivate any roles that have not been assigned. Now, the next step out for that is cleaning up any roles that have been assigned that nobody's using. And I really mean nobody. And this is actually fairly common. Often during implementations or progressively, we had, you had the original sales role that was the standard one, and then you had a sales role, the new sales role, which was your custom one, the company X sales role. And then somebody decided, because they need to make a new dashboard and they need to change some things around it, they made the sales role 2019, right? And these roles are accumulating. Well, if nobody is using the role, even if it's being assigned, then we can actually inactivate those as well. So if, in other words, if nobody in the company is using the original sales role and the sales role from 2015, we can simply inactivate those. And the great time saver about that is when you inactivate them, they disappear from all the employees. So you don't have to go employee by employee, which is if you've got a big sales team or a big company, this is a huge time saver. Inactivating them makes them disappear. It makes the permissions no longer effective, and also means nobody can put them back. So without going through the process of reactivating the role and falling under a change control violation. Finally, we want to go through and look at individual employees and find any roles that nobody's used in 6 months, say. And the reason for that is, or 3 months, or depending on what time period you want to look at. And the reason for that is that this is different from the previous case in that some people are using the role, some people may even be using the role actively, but this person isn't using the role. And therefore, you want to get rid of it. So you can see what we're doing is we're getting narrower and narrower in our focus. Now we're down to looking at individual employees and whether they're actually logging in through a role or not. And if they're not logging into it, take it away. If they need it, they can ask for it back. It's incredibly likely if somebody hasn't logged in with the role in 6 months that they're going to need to log back in. And if they do, they probably should get permission to do so. So this helps you identify those so you can go through and remove that access. And normally for getting ready for a segregation of duties implementation, at this point, you're ready to start applying the segregation of duties rules to understand what the conflicts are within particular roles or across multiple roles. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of explaining how all of that works right now, but it's a very simple process. It's made massively simpler if you got rid of all the unnecessary junk first. Once you get into it, though, what you may run into is a need to understand what permissions somebody's actually using. So we'll look very briefly at some new tools we have coming out that are used to actually analyze permission use within roles. So you can actually see, is anybody actually using this permission? And if they're not, do we need to keep it? This requires some thought, but it just helps you surface that information in a way that makes it actionable. And then finally, at the end of this, you need to establish a role and permission management framework. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be StrongPoint. We have excellent tools for doing this, but you need to have a framework where people just don't give out roles willy-nilly. And I'm sure most of you don't have rule or a framework where that happens. But having a defined framework makes it much easier for you to maintain this. And that framework should probably include periodic re-review of these steps in order to prune your deck. As the Navy says, a messy deck is a dangerous deck because you're going to trip over something, fall overboard, and die. Well, ERP systems are like that too. So we're going to have a cadence of following up on this sort of thing. So what I'm going to do now is show you some of these things in action. As I mentioned, these are available. They originally were part of our segregation of duties package, but then we realized that so many customers needed it also for their change management or for their just like cleanup interests that we've now included in the documentation optimization and the change management packages. So before I get started, I'm going to actually show you a little bit what I mean about integrated SOD, because I think this will help you understand where how simple the future state can be, right? So where you could end up if you wanted to put a framework around this, how simple that framework could be. And so StrongPoint is fully integrated into NetSuite, and when you turn on the SOD package, what you get is an interface that allows you to for people to check whether or not they can give permissions and request permission to give permissions and access directly from the employee record. So right now we're looking at an employee, John Smith, and John has kind of clear SOD status, so he doesn't have any conflicts. And if we take a look at his access, we can see makes sense, right? He just has the controller role, and there's no conflicts inside that role. By the way, this is where global permissions would be assigned on the global permissions tab. We're not going to do that right now. But say, for example, somebody wanted to assign the administrator role. Now, I'm using it as an extreme example, but it makes a point. What they could do is they could find out if they're able to grant it by just hitting preview SOD violations and then checking that. But let's presume that they just went through and they're in HR and somebody says, oh, or they're in IT and somebody says, oh, can you give Bob the administrator role? And then we go to give, it's not Bob, John Smith, the administrator role. And we go in, we go to add John Smith, and then we go to disable. And what StrongPoint is going to do is it's going to check whether John is allowed to have it. And you can see it says, no, John is not allowed to have it because we have a rule that says the admin full access role, and it says you need prior permission to grant this role. You can have rules that say other things, that say, if you do this, just keep in mind that you're going to get a call from the controller or the CISO, whoever manages this in your company. But you can go ahead. Don't have to block things. But generally speaking, we want to block things where the potential outcome is devastating. So giving people admin roles without permission, isn't normally devastating, but it could be. And if somebody was going to try to really mess with your system or take your data, that's the role they probably would want to do it with. And but you can see in this case, there's an existing approval request for the same rule for that person. So somebody's already requested this for John, so you don't need to do it. If you want to see it, you can go here. If it wasn't one, it would automatically give you the interface to request permission, and you can request that permission. And you can do that whether or not it's blocked. The important thing about this is we want to lower the training level so that people don't make mistakes in the future. And so you can set some roles up and say, yeah, I don't care if anybody gives somebody the SDR role. I don't care. I do care if they give them the controller role, or give them the CFO's role, where they can see all the financial information of the company. So the key point about this is where you want to end up, or most of our customers want to end up, is a system where the management of roles is fully controlled, but built right into the employee record. And you don't have to train somebody to use some other system. All right. So having said that, I'm going to go back in and, oh, by the way, there's a full library of rules that comes with the system, so you don't have to make up your own rules. We already have recommended rules, and you can sit down and figure this out. And what this means is that SOD is not just for public companies and regulated companies. It's mandatory for public companies. But for any sizable private company, it's your defense against fraud and embezzlement. And so you may still want to apply some of these rules. If that does apply to you, don't worry about it. We scale our pricing to meet the needs of the customer and the size of the customer. So you're not necessarily paying as much as NetSuite's biggest customers. So let's go back into our searches. So the first thing we want to check is, does anybody have a standard operational role? Because if they do, that's just a role we can't change. So right away, we want to find out if that's happening. And in this case, we can see that Shannon has a standard operational role, and we can, if you want to find out which standard operational roles you had, let's go into search because it didn't seem to like that. Let's try it again. There we go. And there we go. Sorry about that. Setting, the joys of NetSuite expiring search results. So we can see that she has the accountant role, the standard accountant role. And so we can now say, well, okay, we're going to go in and find out whether Shannon should probably have a different role. And even if all you do is go in and say, okay, Shannon had the accountant role, we're now going to make the company X accountant role and copy the standard role exactly the way it is, but give her the new one. That's a better answer, because moving forward, you can change that one as opposed to the standard one, which you can't. You also can't. It's also difficult to change the dashboard and standard roles. There's all sorts of reasons why you don't want people to standard roles. Okay. So the next thing we want to check is does anybody have unused logins? So in other words, is anybody have roles that they're simply not using? And if they do, particularly, look at this. This is a test environment, so lots of people have admin access. Don't worry about this, not a production environment. They use it for testing things, so they have broad permissions. But these people are not using these roles, which means that we can just go ahead and look at whether or not we might want to remove them. Ludo here hasn't used this since September, so maybe we want to talk about him in that context versus Randy Younger, who hasn't used this since 2014. So we can definitely remove that role. What we're trying to do is eliminate complexity. So if you're not using those roles, we can drill right in and go to Randy's record and remove his controller access. Having this sort of overview makes sure that you trap unused roles and remove them as they surface. And in fact, you can put this on a dashboard, right? You shouldn't have any of these. There shouldn't be any unused roles. So on our new dashboards coming out and on our new SOD dashboards coming out, but you can put it on any dashboard. This same search is available in our package, and say, hey, let me know if anybody's got any unused roles, because I'm going to want to go in and clean those up. So when I say that you want to review these on a regular basis, you don't need to necessarily schedule time in your day to do that. You can have NetSuite review the usage of NetSuite and put it up on a dashboard for you. So the next thing we're going to be concerned about are employees with multiple roles. And the concern we have, having learned from our last situation, I'm going to refresh the search. The concern we have is that people with multiple roles almost for sure are going to cause SOD violations. Now, not 100% for sure, because if they're in the situation where they had the old version of the same role, so they had the original sales role, the 2015 sales role, the current sales role, those may have very, very similar permissions. Maybe not exactly the same, but they may not cause an SOD violation. But it still doesn't make sense that for most people, that they have multiple roles at the same time. And there can be some exceptions. In lightly staffed departments, often somebody will have multiple roles for a very practical reason that Mary covers for Bob and Bob covers for Mary, and we just want to manage that. However, for most public companies, that would be an unacceptable practice. What you'd want to do is you would say Mary has Mary's role, Bob has Bob's role, and if Bob needs access to Mary's role, Bob goes through a permissioning process by simply having somebody attempt to give it to him, and you can either have a pre-approval of that or a post-approval. So you can say, okay, you can do that because we know that this happens, but when it happens, it goes on the controller's dashboard to resolve that, and the controller's going to want to make sure that Bob didn't get up to any monkey business in the meantime. And if anybody's named Bob out there, apologies, I'm going to keep throwing Bob under the bus. Okay, so this we can go in and we can see that they have multiple roles, and we can go in and we can drill into it and find out if they have which roles they have, and it alerts you right away to you know, the fact that they have an admin role, which in this case, because it's a test account, it's not that unusual. If you saw this in your real account, this would be a cause of very significant concern. And when you drill into it, there's another view where you can drill into it, and you can see exactly, you know, which roles are whichever makes more sense to you. Some customers like the first one, and they can just drill right down and say, oh, I want to see what John has access to, so I'm going to drill into John Albura here and see his administrator and StrongPoint developer role, whereas other people want to see more of this view. There's just two different views that we've developed over time. All right, so at this point, we have a really firm understanding of scope. We understand, hopefully we've gone through and we've made a plan that we're going to switch out any standard roles that are being used. We've identified any roles that people have that they're not using at all, so we can remove those roles from those people. And then we can, we've also identified people with multiple roles, so we can start asking the question, why does this person have multiple roles? And probably go through and clean that up ahead of time. The reason why this comes early is this is a business conversation. You have to go to their supervisor and say, does Jan here really need both the billing agent and the purchasing agent role, because those seem to be two different jobs? And the answer may very well be yes. There's a business justification for that. They do need that. By the way, you can actually, if you want to document that somebody's allowed to do this, you can do this in our SOD system. So you can say, oh, Bob is allowed to violate this rule. And then later on, there'll be documentation of the decision that was taken. And then we talked about you and what we want to look at the global permissions. So you're going to say, okay, does anybody have global permissions? In this case, we see that Shannon Scott Kelly has accounting lists, global permission. When we go in and take a look at Shannon's employee record, we can see that this actually doesn't create an SOD violation. So she has a permission, but the permission actually doesn't cause any problem. There's no compliance problem. And the reason for that is that she already has the accountant role and the administrator role. So it's not the global permission that's causing the problem, right? And she's presumably got approval already, must have approval already to be the administrator. So she already had the administrator approved. So if you have administrator, having administrator and something else doesn't produce an SOD violation, because administrator includes everything. So once you got permission to administrator, it's okay if you have other violations as well. Okay, so now we've identified and normally gone through and removed any global permissions, because those are probably left over from some point in the past. And now we're going to start to analyze the actual roles themselves. And so the first thing we're going to look for are completely unused roles. So these roles are not, this is a test account, so most of the unused roles have never ever been used. You see some of them were actually used back in 2014. Yes, StrongPoint has been around long enough that things got used in 2014. And what's actually happening here is that StrongPoint is actually looking at when somebody's actually logged in and used the role, and it's figured out what dates at the date last used of the role, which is essentially the last time the role was actually logged in by anybody. And then in addition, we're showing any of the other aspects of this. So we can see that all roles will always be treated as a complex change, because you need to think through a lot of stuff, but we can immediately see, is there anything that's specifically dependent on the role? And we'll see that, you know, some roles come out of bundles. And I think somewhere down here we can see that there's some specific searches and views that are tied to these roles. So we'd want to know that, because if we're cleaning up the roles, this is going to give us an indication of what's important. We can also sometimes see workflows or scripts that have dependency upon roles. And so bundle dependency, You take away the role, it doesn't mean it's going to, if you take it away, it's going to come back again next time the managed bundle is updated. So you can take away from people, but you can't really get rid of it out of the system. You're going to be very concerned if you have roles that have scripts and workflows. If the role itself isn't being used and has a script or workflow dependency, that does not necessarily mean the script or the workflow is not necessary, because sometimes it'll just be doing a check against a role to see if the person's in this role, do X, if the person's in this role, do Y. Well, nobody uses role X, but should definitely indicate that maybe you might want to take a look at that script, because usually what will have happened is somebody will have actually created a new role, not realizing that the old role had dependencies on scripts, and the new script may not have advantage of understanding that. This is a great example of where the combination of metadata is really, really useful for cleaning things up. Now, there's an entire process as part of the documentation optimization system about how do you actually go about this. So if you're going to clean these up, you should probably get permission to do so. And so you can actually create change requests directly from within this save search and go into the change review process. And of course, our change management process integrates very tightly with Jira and ServiceNow, which are very commonly used for change management processes. But in a cleanup sense, it tends to run backwards. So normally it runs from Jira or ServiceNow, tickets coming into StrongPoint for validation as part of the change management process. In this case, it's going to go the other way around. It's going to start in StrongPoint, where all the data about what's being used is, and then go backwards up into Jira ServiceNow if that's where you do your approvals. But now this is showing us these roles are presently, although they have been used, they are not presently assigned to anybody. So we can go into these, and if we go into the there we go, manage roles, any of these, I'll just pick out one that was in that result. Unused roles, so the developer role, right? So I can just go into the manage roles, and I can go look for my my developer role and say, well, we don't use that role, so I can inactivate it. When I inactivate it, nobody will be able to assign it again without reactivating it. And reactivating it, StrongPoint will catch that and warn somebody that that the role was reactivated. And if you're using StrongPoint SOD and you really don't want somebody giving back this role, then it will actually block them from granting the role to somebody. So you can reactivate it, but you need a prior approval to sign it, just like we saw with the administrator role, if you want to set it up that way. Okay, so we are able to identify roles that are not assigned at all. Our next group are ones that are assigned, but the person's not actually using it. So nobody's actually using it. So in other words, they are presently assigned to people, but they still have date last used. That's a long time ago. So the reason this is different is that in the first case, you know that nobody's assigned to them, so it's very, very low risk. In the second case, it's slightly higher risk, but actually the step for resolving this is exactly the same. You don't have to go employee by employee by employee to do this. You can simply go to the manage roles screen and pick out the role that number 4 VP sales. You don't use that role. If you click inactive right here, it will disappear from all the employees, and therefore will no longer be assigned. So now one thing to remember is if you unclick it, it goes back, and then we'll end up on the unused roles again. So if you decide to make it active again, it will return. Now some people find that reassuring because that means you can go backwards really quickly. Some people find that kind of alarming. It's an important fact to note, and it's actually mentioned specifically in our guide to remind people that unclicking or reactivating a role could potentially reassign it. Now, if you're using StrongPoint, we will automatically alert management that all of a sudden this role was just assigned to 20 people, and that will show up as a non-compliant change. And if you were trying to do it with SOD, you get similar SOD violations. So as soon as the role was assigned, we would then process all the SOD and figure out if there was now a rule violation. The one thing about active SOD or integrated SOD or integrated access control and tight role management right within NetSuite is you do not want to do an audit 3 months later and find out somebody got access to your system and sent your data to Russia. That's not a good operational plan. What you want is continuous audit of access and permissions in your system, but you just don't want people to do it. You want people to be busy pushing the company forward and have the software do all the monitoring. So once we've actually gone through and we found the ones that are assigned but not in use, we can then also take a look at any assignments where the person hasn't logged in for 6 months. So these are assigned, but they haven't logged in for a period of time. And so now we're going through and we're getting more and more granular. Now we're looking at roles that are in use, that are used by somebody, but they haven't been used for a period of time. Now, the reason why VPSL shows up in here twice is because you haven't done the cleanup. As you do each of these cleanups, the next list you get to gets shorter and shorter and shorter, which is why doing it in the right order makes sense, because now you're getting down into things where you're going to have to go individually and change it at the employee level. So these, the first changes we can make just by inactivating the role. Once we get down here, we're gonna have to go to each person and remove it. And in our system, that would require a change request normally to document why you did it. But either way, it's going to be, you're going to end up with lots of granular lines of things you need to clean up. So that takes you all the way down. By this point, you will have only roles in your system that are actually used by people, and there will be no standard roles in use, and there will be no, and there as few people as possible having multiple roles, and as few global permissions as possible. And that's going to give you the best opportunity for a successful and rapid rollout of SOD. And we ran tests on this. If you actually know the account you're working in, you can imagine you can do this very, very quickly. It's the last step, this step where we go through and go, okay, these people haven't logged in doing these roles, and we maybe want to talk about why they even have these roles. That part may require a little bit of conversation inside the company, but most of the rest of it you can decide in advance that our policy is you do not keep roles in these situations. And that's the best practice, is to say our policy is, but when you're doing it for the first time, you might want to double check, because people may clearly will not have been following the policy. But you can get through this really quickly, which means that when you run our SOD library against your system, or at least a portion of it that relate to the business processes you have, then you're going to get as few violations as possible. And the only violations you would have, or for most people, the only violations would be intra-role, inside one role. And those are much easier to fix. Now, when you go to fix them, you're going to want to know what people are actually doing with the system. And so, for example, we have a tool set. This is actually just being rolled out right now. There's some tweaking going on around it, but it's feature utilization based on system notes. Basically, what it does is it'll show you whether, in this case, the administrator is creating and setting checks, but through bulk processing. And this is really just a clever use of system notes. And it's built into our workflow, because the next step you're going to want to do is go through and before you run the SOD library, it might be really useful to go role by role to see what the heck people are actually using, and ask yourself, I wonder if we can get rid of some of those permissions. Or you might want to run the SOD library first, and then you've got some violations. You can run it in test mode, so you don't need to create violations right away. You can run it in test mode, and then when you want to go through this and go, well, is anybody actually doing any of these things? No. Well, if they're not doing it, then it's pretty, it's much safer to remove the ability to do it. And you can look at this on any record at all. If you look at it on an entity basis, you can actually go through and say, look, we need to know about this completely. So we need to know that scheduled workflows, and I think there was some scripting in here too, are doing things. They're changing values in the system on various different records. But the ones we're really concerned we were concerned about this because we'd like to know what workflow is doing that. And of course, in StrongPoint, if you're StrongPoint, you can look up and see what workflows touch the SOD status field and try to understand why this is going on. But you're really, from an SOD point of view, you're really concerned about this. Now, this type of information is super useful because you can't just remove a permission. You can't just remove a permission because it's not being used through the UI if it's actually required for example, a user event workflow. So the person never goes in and actually edits that field. They do something in another record that causes that field to be updated. Therefore, they're going to need the permission that affects access to that field. So not quite the same thing as permissions at this point, but it's the information you need to manage permissions. So we covered a lot of ground, talking about all the way from why you need it, why you need to do this, what would motivate you to do it, why the order in which you do things is correct, and then where most of our customers want to end up at is a really clean set of rules so they can democratize this process. So they can go back and cause a much more simpler process for people to be able to grant permissions and remove permissions on an ongoing basis. So I hope this was interesting and helpful. Remember, most of the things I've described today, you can actually do without StrongPoint. In fact, a very large number of them. They're just very, very, very careful and clever uses of metadata that already exists inside NetSuite that our team has put together. And the guide describes this. What we've done is we've integrated into some additional metadata and processes to make it much easier to manage. And the big difference between using StrongPoint to do this and doing it manually is that StrongPoint can then be, StrongPoint will continuously manage it, continuously audit, and then put a gateway around it so it doesn't become a mess again. So having said that, I wondered if there are any questions. And I'm just going to pause this for a second. And if you do, there's one question already. Right, how can somebody with administrator role not have an SOD violation with any other role? And and it's a very good question. I think I covered it. From the administrator role is in itself an SOD violation. Like the administrator could do everything, and so therefore it's just superfluous to tell people that that you have an SOD violation. You would have every single SOD violation, right? So it would just become a pain to look at. So if they had the administrator, they would have an SOD violation. They just have one, which basically says they have the administrator role and the power to do everything, which is problematic, and you need to document why they have it, right? And the administrator access is, from an SOD perspective, a necessary evil. What you're going to want to do, though, and this is a very good point, is StrongPoint comes also with a set of detective controls that sit around this that allow you to monitor administrator behavior to make sure that the administrator is not actually doing things they're not supposed to be doing. So we have built-in controls for administrator transactional behavior. And of course, if administrators behaved in any way, in a self-approving way on any other transaction, we have a whole set of detective controls that allow you to trap their actual behavior and therefore prove that your administrators are not actually self-dealing across the whole company. So normally, using our detective controls, our continuous audit detective controls with the SOD system is the most practical way to resolve that. And by the way, that's also an excellent way to resolve any other SOD violation. If you don't want to change your role, you can often relieve the SOD violation using a detective control, such as the ones in our library. That's sort of out of the scope of this discussion today. Happy to drill into it with anybody who's more interested. Great. Well, there's the other question that we commonly get is, how long does it take to implement, to clean up roles or to implement SOD? And of course, that varies widely by the complexity of the company. But if you follow these practices, generally speaking, we're seeing, you can get through a role cleanup very, very quickly, and you can thereby um, I've done it on an account I didn't even know about in an afternoon, right? I'd never seen before, and done it in an afternoon. Just when we're doing testing, we use some examples. But with larger accounts, it may take longer. But if you think about it, you're trying to limit the number of things you're doing user by user by user in this process. And I got to thank you. So thanks, Beth. Thank you. And yes, Rahel asks, can we find a list of best practices for role cleanup and SOD? And yes, we can. We have a guide to doing this that walks through how do you rapidly implement SOD. And so if you could just reach out to us, or actually, I'll reach out. We'll get somebody to reach out to you, and we will share that with you. But absolutely, the best practices, we are very happy to share with anybody, whether or not you're a customer. There's a question about how does the licensing work. The licensing for StrongPoint is tiered by the level of product that you buy and by the size of company that you are. And these particular capabilities we talked about today, with the exception of the actual SOD interface itself, which is part of our compliance product, is in our documentation optimization product. So it's actually in almost our bottom product, one of our less expensive products, just because it's so broadly applicable. And the SOD part is built into our enterprise compliance product. And the pricing ranges from, the StrongPoint pricing ranges from 10,000 on the bottom end to 30,000 or up, depending on, for very large customers, on the top end. But there's also Flashlight, and so many of the capabilities we talked about today. If you're just getting started, Flashlight's a great way to get started. It's a free trial; you can get going right away. And it's priced on. It's the only product we have that's priced on a user basis. Everything else is priced on a team basis. And Damien asked if we would share the deck with you. Absolutely. We'll be sending out a recording and a link to this deck. And I'll also include, actually, for everybody, a link to the guide for that Rahel asked for. And Damien's asking a ton of questions, and he's an existing customer. So thank you, Damien. We'll follow up with you. I'll get your CS rep to follow up with you after the call. So we have a couple of minutes. So if people have additional questions, I'm happy to answer them. I love the engagement. Well, having seen nobody's putting anything in, I'd like to thank you. It is a great pleasure for me to talk to you about this. This company was founded because I found these sorts of problems so infuriating that I decided I was going to launch a company to solve them, and it was great fun for me today to talk to you about it. If you have any questions, or if you think about something afterwards, my email is mark.walker@strongpoint.io. You can reach out to me. There's also our various members of our account management and sales teams, but also our customer success team. So please do reach out, and each of you that have reached out to me today, I'll follow up with you specifically, and the rest of everybody, you'll all be getting the same materials in the hope that it would help you manage your NetSuite accounts and have an even happier new year with NetSuite. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of your afternoon.